All right, Alexander, let's talk about everything that is happening in the UK. By everything, I mean all of the riots, protests, violence, whatever you want to call it or label it. Keir Starmer has labeled it thuggery. That's the word that he used in a statement he made the other day. And he said that his government is going to crack down on the thuggery, whether it's on the streets or whether it's online. He talks a lot about cracking down online, Keir Starmer, which is terrifying, but so is Keir Starmer's talk about cracking down on everything that is happening offline as well. Very scary words from Starmer. What are your thoughts on everything that is happening in the UK?
Indeed, and Starmer's words provide the clue to an awful lot of what is actually going on. Now, can I say, of course, I live in the United Kingdom. I live in London, in a quiet part of London, but I've been phoning around and checking out the various people I know around the country. And I've also been checking the local media and all that. Now, I think there's something I do need to say, because if you are reading the international media, you might run away with the idea that there's a massive insurrection underway in the United Kingdom, that there's, vast, armies of protesters, filling the streets, always referred to, by the way, as far-right protesters, that there's massive amounts of property damage being done, that the situation is unstable, that Britain is on the brink of a civil war or is heading in that direction. I have to say, this is not the impression at all of the true condition of the country as I've been able to assess it. Certainly not in London to any extent, but even outside London, in the various towns and cities where I've been in touch with. Yes, there are protests, but they are relatively small. They are focused on a number of important things. The protest in Southport was provoked by a particularly horrible and grisly murder, the details of which I am not going to go into because I find it uncomfortable to talk about murders like that, but a particularly grisly murder involving 3 young children by obviously a very dangerous young man who is now apparently, he is in custody if it was him, which he almost certainly was. So, now this is not unusual in the United Kingdom. Can I say this? I mean, it's a point, perhaps I should say, when violent incidents of this kind take place, it is not unprecedented for protests to take place. Sometimes those protests turn violent themselves. There was an attack on a mosque in this occasion. But, this is not unique. And by the way, and for the record, rioting in Britain in the summer, in the hot summer weeks, is not so rare either. It's something that regularly happens. Now, I don't want to trivialize this, and there are differences between these events, these latest protests, and the more commonplace events that take place on a more regular basis in Britain. But what makes these protests completely unique is that usually the authorities, when they happen, try to calm the situation down. They tell people that things are under control. The police have things in hand. The number of protesters is small. The number of riots are small. The extent of the property damage isn't huge. And then gradually these things ebb out and die by themselves. This time, on the contrary, the government, the media, and all kinds of other commentators are going out of their way to talk this up, to make it look as if some enormous, violent, mass protest movement by people, they don't like on the far right is underway. And they're using this extraordinary rhetoric, this very, very dangerous rhetoric, not only to keep the riots going and the protests going, because, of course, this kind of rhetoric itself can feed on these events, but also, I have no doubt about it, to prepare us for a whole campaign of restrictions on speech, restrictions on the right to protest, all of those things, which it was clear to me were part of the Starmer government's agenda all along.
What should Starmer have done? What would a normal government in the UK have done? Previous government to these protests and riots.
Well, first of all, they should have said that the police have their support, that the police have the situation under control, that people shouldn't panic. They should not hesitate to call the police. They should appoint a minister to take overall charge of this. And I'll tell you something, in the past, when there have been protests, I remember protests that took place in the early 1980s, for example, which involved a completely different community in Brixton. Well, on that occasion, there was concern that the protests that were taking place then did draw on genuine grievances. And as I remember, a judge, Lord Justice Starmer, was appointed to investigate and to provide a report and to explain why the protests were going on and to try to look for solutions. Now, nothing, of course, like that is being proposed this time. But there is no doubt at all that what the government did at that time, it was Margaret Thatcher's government too, by the way, what the government did at that time did play a significant role in diffusing the situation. And by the way, the protests then, as I remember, this is from memory, I might be wrong here, but the protests then were both more extensive and significantly more destructive than the protests that we are seeing at the moment. Now, that is just, my own impression. But then I, remember the time in London in 1981 and the time in the UK in 1981. And when those protests took place and the protests that we're seeing now, which seem to me to be on a significantly smaller scale. If I could just say something, there are causes to these protests. One is the issue that everybody talks about, which is the issue of migration, which the government itself acknowledges as an issue. All sorts of people are telling us, let's not talk about it, but it is, of course, an issue. I'm not saying that it justifies protests or people acting in the way that it does, but that is an issue. But beyond that, there is the very difficult social and economic situation we have in Britain, which we've been talking about on this channel in program after program. We have a political class which is deeply unpopular. We've had an election where the governing party has emerged with a gigantic lopsided majority on 34% of the vote in an election with a very low turnout. Only a fifth of the electorate actually voted for them. One person in five. And yet, they are in almost undisputed power. We have a situation where in many working class areas up and down the country, the government, the Labour Party, which used to represent working class, organised labour, has basically turned its back on the people who live there. We have a very difficult economic situation, very, very low growth for many years now, stagnant or falling living standards for many people. We've just had the government provide a pre-budget statement. The Chancellor, the Finance Minister, we call them Chancellor, Rachel Reeves, gave a speech to the House of Commons in which she said, don't expect any great spending or investment program from us. We've just been elected to office. We've discovered that there's a £20 billion hole in the budget figures. So we're going to have to cut services even further, some services even further, and we're going to have to raise taxes, which is, by the way, not what they said they would do in the election. She's pretending that she didn't know about this $20 billion pound hole in the budget. Everybody knew about it. It was discussed extensively in alternative media. You can find all kinds of programs which people talked about it. The various economists were talking about it, but she's now pretending that she's only just discovered it, and so she's going to impose higher taxes and cut welfare and cut spending, investment spending, not so much welfare spending, but some welfare spending too, even further. So people are feeling under an awful lot of pressure. And in these kind of conditions, you get an awful lot of angry people, a lot of people who feel that they're not being listened to and that their grievances are not being addressed. And I'm afraid, I'm very sorry to say this, and I don't, countenance this at all, but some of them go altogether too far and start to engage in this kind of riotous activity, which, to be clear, is against the law. It's completely wrong. Riots are not something I have any time for, and obviously they should be, dealt with in a proper legal way, using, proper legal procedures. However, even that I'm becoming concerned about, because the government says that the courts need to be active, night and day, keeping the process going, so that people can be arrested and immediately charged and sent to prison instantly, which to me, and I say this as somebody who worked in a court once upon a time, looks like the government is prepared to throw even due process out of the window, which I have to say doesn't surprise me. So we have a very difficult situation in Britain, and the fact needs to be acknowledged. And unless people do start to address that, then I'm afraid problems like this will recur and they will get worse. And the government's response is repression. As I said, getting the courts operating 24 hours a day, calling people all sorts of names, making up that something far worse is happening than the bad things that are actually happening, giving the impression around the world that the country is in a state of violent insurrection when it isn't, and preparing all sorts of restrictions on free speech and the right to protest, which is a massive leap, as far as I'm concerned, in the wrong direction. That's my view.
Yeah, but, the Starmer government, like all the governments in the collective West, they can solve these problems if they just decided to govern, to actually govern. There are difficulties in the collective West, but they can be resolved. But you have to take your country's interests into consideration. You have to put them above everything else. And this is something that the Starmer government will never do and is not prepared to do. They're not in office to do such a thing. They've been in office to look after the interests of other institutions, other countries, other people, globalists. Instead of governing, what they're going to do is they're going to look to consolidate more power and more control.
That's exactly correct.
That's going to be online control and online control as well as offline control. That's exactly what they're going to do. But I mean, these are problems, situations that can be resolved if you have competent leaders. Keir Starmer's not that leader. He's not that guy. Nor was Sunak. Nor was Truss. Nor was Boris Johnson. None of these guys are able to actually problem solve. But what they can do is they can do what you said. They can put out these statements that they're going to crack down and surveil and censor and do God knows what else. And that's how they're going to go about this.
Indeed. And the other thing they're doing, and I don't know whether I'm sure this isn't intentional, but it is the effect, which is, of course, they're setting communities off against each other. I mean, I'm not saying that they're the only people who do that. There are, of course, the street corner agitators who get involved, but the government itself is giving the impression that there is an enormous tidal wave of antagonism from one community towards other communities. And I have to be very careful what I say here, because I don't want to, make this even worse than it is. But already you can see people are starting to think of themselves, think of each other one community start to feel threatened and insecure as a result very much of what the government is saying, whereas the government ought to be going out of its way to reassure everybody that the government will be there to make sure that they're safe and well. And instead, as I said, all the rhetoric makes them feel unsafe, which is another point to say, as I said, in the context of what are, well, I don't want to minimize them, but protests that are not out of control. Coming back to what you say, you are absolutely perfectly right. There's a famous expression attributed to the French Prime Minister, the former French Prime Minister, Mendes France, to govern is to choose. The government isn't choosing to govern. It's not interested in governing. As you correctly said, it's interested in control. And of course, all the indications are that things are going to start getting an awful lot worse. Now, we are all aware that there's been major problems in the markets. We've had it's actually been building. You follow the markets more closely than me, but as I understand it, things have been getting more and more edgy in the markets for some weeks now. There's been sell-offs here and sell-offs there. There's been a massive sell-off in Japan. There are all lots of indications that we're heading for recession in the United States. If there's a recession in the United States, we're going to be in an even bigger recession in Britain. That is a reality. Europe, of course, is in recession and has been continuously now for several years. So with all of that, failing to govern effectively, failing to give people a sense of, the government has a sense of purpose and ideas and direction, which, I think people would be prepared to accept, some level of austerity if they thought that it would eventually lead to something better. But the government doesn't offer that either. It doesn't give a sense of direction, it doesn't give a sense of purpose. It doesn't seem to be interested in governing. It seems to be responding all the time to events. It is becoming increasingly repressive. Of course, in an economic recession, economic crisis situation, the pressure cooker is going to become much greater. And then, of course, the risk is that instead of the rather, I'm not going to say minor riots, but riots that are, fairly containable that we have at the moment and which do not seem to me outside the normal, pattern of summer riots that we fairly regularly see in Britain. Not every summer, but some summers. We might indeed end up with a situation where the political situation in Britain becomes a lot more difficult. I'm not suggesting, by the way, again, that there's going to be riots and protests and that kind of thing. I don't think this is the British way, but we could find ourselves with industrial unrest, for example, starting to happen on a significant scale with all kinds of much bigger protests, peaceful protests, lawful protests, but on a very, very much bigger scale, and new political forces starting to emerge. And I suspect that if that happens, the Starmer government's response will be the same as the one we have seen over the last few days. They will start calling everybody names and reaching for the toolkit to increase repression.
Yeah, the wrong leader at the wrong time.
Absolutely.
I think that's been Britain's problem over the past 3-4 years. A succession
Absolutely.
of wrong leaders, wrong people at the wrong time.
Absolutely.
Yeah, stop spending on these wars. Tap out of Project Ukraine. No matter how much you're in love with Zelensky, whichever UK Prime Minister you can bring up. No matter how much you're infatuated with Zelensky, you don't have the money. Tap out of Ukraine. Tell the U.S. you don't have the money either. Tell the U.S. that you're not interested in a war in the Middle East. You don't have the money for it. Deal with your border and just tell everybody we have to get our house in order. So we're going to look to put together an economic plan. There might be some economic austerity. We'll get through it. and that's how you go about it.
Absolutely.
These are not difficult problems to solve, or these are difficult problems, but they can be solved if you have the right leader.
Well, indeed.
But you have to look after your country's interests first.
Absolutely. Britain remains, in some respects, in most respects, a fairly wealthy country. It's got lots of resources. It's pretty big. There's lots of, capable and energetic people in Britain. All you need to do is have a government like that. Now, an Attlee government might have done it. A Thatcher government might have done it. A Keir Starmer government. All I can say is, it's, as you correctly said, the wrong leader at the wrong time. Given an outsized majority, which he didn't earn, and owing allegiance to people who are elsewhere.
I was going to say the same thing. Yeah, maybe we're looking at it wrong. Maybe for the globalists, Johnson, Truss, Sunak, Starmer are the right leaders for them at this time. Who knows? Maybe it's on which side you're sitting on is how you should look at it.
And since you brought up the subject of the border, which I'm sure is what a lot of people are interested in, the fact is every single British government that I can remember, going all the way back to Tony Blair's, tells us that, there's things that need to be done to bring the border issue back under control. And nothing happens. It just goes on exactly as always. It's exactly the same. That gets worse. The problems, as they all admit, by the way. We're not saying anything that they're not admitting to themselves. They just go on getting worse. They all say that they're going to turn it and change it and move it around, and they never do.
Yeah, just fix it. Solve it.
Yeah.
Stop creating chaos and war outside of your borders. And then you can start to fix your problems inside of your borders. You start fixing the border itself. It's not rocket science.
No, and don't tell the world that, as I said, the country's about to collapse into insurrection when it's not. And don't set communities against each other, and don't engage in rhetoric which leads everybody to think that the situation in Britain is far worse than it actually is.
Anyway, it seems like chaos is actually the plan from the elites.
Oh, no, well, indeed.
Go figure.
All
right. We will end it there. TheDuran.locals.com. We are on Rumble, Odyssey, BitChute, Telegram, Rockfin, and Twitter X. And go to the Duran shop, pick up some merch like the blue polo that Alexander is wearing today, or the T-shirts that I am wearing today with the Greek flag and the Duran logo. Take care.